How do you get innovative medical treatments to the patients who need it most? It's one thing to discover and develop a novel therapy, and another to bring that product to market. Clearing regulatory hurdles and conducting effective, efficient clinical trials requires unique knowledge and skill sets. And while many large pharmaceutical companies have that knowledge and talent in-house, smaller companies often do not. Small and mid-sized biotechs that want to make a big difference need to think big. I'm your host, Jennifer Fink, and I am pleased to welcome you to the inaugural episode of Thinking Big for Small and Mid-Sized Biotechs, a podcast featuring seasoned experts who share strategies small and mid-sized companies can use to get innovative treatments to those who need them. With me today is MerriBeth Adams, an expert in regulatory strategy. MerriBeth began her career working in a hospital laboratory and learned regulatory requirements and strategy from the ground up. She now has more than 30 years' experience in clinical, regulatory, and government affairs for the analytic, medical device, and pharmaceutical industry. And she served as the Director of Research for the New Jersey chapter of the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence, as well as the Chief Regulatory Officer for both Rapid Pharmaceuticals, a company developing novel therapeutics, and Advise Clinical LLC, a clinical research and strategic advisory organization. MerriBeth is currently the Senior Vice President of the Consulting Business Unit at Allucent. Thank you for joining us today, MerriBeth.
My pleasure, Jennifer.
Tell us a little bit about your experience helping small and mid-sized biotechs navigate the regulatory process to get products to patients. I know you have had some experiences that have been powerful where you've made a big difference.
Well, Jennifer, it's always a good idea with small and upcoming biotechs to start at the beginning with the end in mind. When I say that, it's really about what is the final goal. The goal for my small biotech company is I want my product on the market as soon as possible, as efficiently and financially prudent as possible, and to make sure that I could get those needed medications, pharmaceuticals, or med device directly to the people who need them most. In order to do that, one of the things that I've done throughout my career is talk to that client, understand what their needs are, where they are in the process from their own minds or their own plans, and then sit down and talk about how we go forward. And to go forward, we need to know where they are today. So in doing that, I always look at a gap. Where are they today in their process of development? And not just from a regulatory standpoint, but where are they with toxicology, non-clinical? Have they been first in human? Do they have batches made or intending to make of product that'll go into that patient? And by doing that, we start to put together a gap analysis, talk to them about strategy, and then move forward on this regulatory roadmap. A lot of folks will come back and say, gee, I really can't afford to do that. I don't have the time and I don't have the money. And so what I tried to impart to them, and I'll give you a couple examples, is it's not as expensive as you think it is. We have that opportunity from the beginning to build not only the proper path, and maybe they don't have to do certain things for the stage they're in, so we could save them time and money. A good example of that is I have a long-standing client who came back to me after they had their biologics license application, BLA, rejected twice. None of us want to see a refuse to file. And so we sat down with them again and looked at it, and here it was chemistry manufacturing issues that needed to be addressed back in their phase 2 studies. This cost our company 3 years of revenue and delay in getting treatment to patients that needed it. This is an orphan biologic for a congenital indication, and there was no other treatment available. So I sat down, looked at the gap, went back again, and had the group take our advice and strategy, or mine, and including going back to the FDA on a 483 remediation, helped them plan audit services, strategy consulting. I helped rewrite the BLA and had multiple FDA meetings, which was so integral because they needed to change how they approached the agency and interacted. And that's one of the things that we were able to do, give them a robust submission. And now they received not only their approval, but the award of a pediatric rare disease voucher, which is worth about $105 million in of itself. And that treatment is now available to those in need. I can't say it was all just a smooth path, but that communication between the consultant, the client, and the agency really helped turn things around. So that product is now on the market. So we're really happy with how it turned out for them.
Wow. And so taking that time to sit down and say, okay, this is what we have. We're not getting there. What do we need? Looking at that gap analysis without taking that time, investing that time, this product still might not be getting to children who need it.
That was the case. And it was a very hard lesson because in their heart of hearts, they wanted to do what was right. They knew their product was going to work, but they just needed to follow the steps in the roadmap to get it to the next stage, and then the next stage, and to go to approval. And so it's very hard sometimes for folks to sit back and say, maybe I pay me now or pay me later, not in dollars, but in time and investment in understanding where they really were in the development cycle.
I so appreciate what you said. You said that, it may not be as expensive as you think it is to pause and invest in taking this time to develop a regulatory strategy, to get some expert assistance. I know myself, if I am planning a trip, I'm excited. I want to hit the road and I just want to go. But if I don't take some time to plan it out along the way, I can waste a lot of time and gas and miss things versus if I take some time up front and plan. And this sounds sort of similar, MerriBeth. You're saying that it may be more prudent to take this time, as enthusiastic as you are, more prudent to take this time, bring in some professionals who can really help you develop a regulatory strategy so you can work with the agencies, work with the experts to get this to the people who need it as efficiently as possible.
Yes. And Jennifer, there's always that aspect of, I know it works. I think it works this way. But when you talk to other people, you start to realize, oh gosh, I never thought of this step. Or nothing like dropping off this beautiful piece of equipment at a hospital whose main job every day is to treat patients, and asking them to evaluate it with a great big book of all the forms they have to fill out. And if they would have just sat back and did this planning early on, it would have been so much easier for them to get the input of others as they're doing their strategy and development.
So, at what point should companies be thinking about, I need to bring in somebody, I need to develop a regulatory strategy? At what point should they think about that? And then how do you begin doing that?
Almost at the beginning. And again, I always say, look at the end, or start at your beginning, looking at the end in mind. So we take things, and we're called in all the time for things just coming out of discovery, translational science. So we deal with hospitals, laboratories, and universities, or government contracts where they'll come through and they know they have this entity, which is some form of molecule or biologic, and they want to know, okay, we're going to get investment. We're going to turn this now into something that's commercially viable. So one of my goals is to listen to them, help them put together even a target product profile, which includes that gap in the strategy, but also looking at what other like products are on the market, who's your competitor, and we help them with what other hurdles in development, maybe issues with manufacturing a type of molecule, or what government agencies have come back and said, we have concerns about this type of product going into the disease indication? And do you have the right disease indication? An example I'd kind of like to give you is a product that didn't make it through approval because it was developed, as they told me when the call came in, we have the cure for AIDS. And I said, oh, that's interesting. You have the cure for HIV/AIDS. And this was a very young, naive company who had taken over a product that was discovered elsewhere. They didn't even have manufacturing. It was being made in very tiny lab batches. And to look at that first in humans, well, they had taken their lab batches and tried it out on some patients under emergency use approval. And they felt, well, gee, the patients woke up, they got better. They hadn't looked at what it takes to take a drug all the way through. So helping them through that process, and I could tell you that they fought every step of the way, but 2 adequate and well-controlled studies were then conducted. Manufacturing was brought up to speed, and we found out at the end of the day it had no difference on the viral load in HIV/AIDS than current standard of care at that time. However, we looked at some of the other data that was being collected. The drug was then repurposed with a full strategy and regulatory pathway as a signaling peptide, and how it had effect on things like how the cellular structure of our body acts to an insult. We call it the immediate early gene expression. Do we get a rash? And what is the balance of what I call cytokines and chemokines? Bringing that back into balance, very similar to yin and yang. And took this drug through, and it actually showed promise for psoriasis, other inflammatory processes such as chronic fatigue, post-encephalitis, traumatic brain injury. Again, all inflammatory processes by different agents. As a result of that and non-clinical work, we also showed that it helped with the brain tumor at that time of AIDS called progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, today known as PML. And taking it through that whole process, we became that partner with the team. I sat in an office in New York. They were in California, but it was like they were down the hall. And we took ownership, and it had that excitement. We celebrated the wins. We cried over the losses because a lot of people at that time were passing away. But at the end of the day, we had 25 individuals who were treated, and 3 of those are alive today, 28 years later.
Oh, wow.
And for that patient, their family, and that little group that was there, what could have been better for them? If you ask me why I do what I do, that's exactly it. We're helping that client, that patient, and becoming almost embedded in that process. And even though we're giving information, we're getting new technology, new information coming along all the way.
It's so helpful to have external eyes. When you create your own product, when you write your own sentences, it's very difficult sometimes to spot misspellings or typos, right? And when you get external eyes on something, they can often see things that you can't, and they often know things that you don't. No individual, if it's not your specialty, has time to keep up with the constant evolution of regulations.
Absolutely. I try to keep up as much as I can, but I can tell you that others around me, day to day, they'll say, have you seen what hit the FDA website today? Did you see what the EMA advisory committee said when someone's going for that regulatory strategy support? We have to have that regulatory intelligence, as I call it, where we can really impart that back to folks who may not even know what they don't know.
It strikes me as you told that powerful story that you went essentially from, we have the cure for AIDS, which would be huge. Having a cure for AIDS was the holy grail. And that's not what ended up happening, but this was a powerful, promising treatment. And by continuing through the process, by working together, Instead of looking at the regulatory process as a series of hurdles or barriers, you progressed through, you got information, you worked with the information you had, and you kept working with the team and got to a point that perhaps nobody foresaw in the beginning, but ultimately had a very positive outcome for a number of patients and families and for the company.
They sure did. And, we all don't know what we don't know. And having that sounding board, setting up that dialogue with the regulatory agencies, they want to succeed. FDA doesn't sit there to say, well, I don't like that drug. That's not the point at all. They're trying to impart what you need to do. And sometimes you have to help educate them, especially when you're in uncharted territory.
I think that's such an important point. You said that setting up that dialogue with the regulatory agencies, the FDA is really not there to say, nope, sorry, don't like it, go back. You're talking about working in partnership, gathering this information, bringing it back to the company and saying, hey, this is what they need, this is what they're looking for. How can we get this? Because doing that will ultimately save time compared to, company doing whatever they do, then going to the regulatory process and them saying, well, no, you needed X, Y, and Z, and you only have A, B, and C.
Exactly. And sometimes the agency will take what they know or what they know about others following the path that you are and try to get you to think about it. They will never come out and tell you, oh, you need to do X. But they're trying to get you to think in a broader aspect or trying to get you to understand, have you looked at all your adverse events? Have you looked at your study endpoints? And I know in one of the To Come podcasts, one of our clinical folks is going to be going through that, but looking at those endpoints. And from a regulatory standpoint, then those endpoints and that data that you collect from the patients are going to go on the product label. So it all comes together. And if you can have that advice and guidance as you're going, FDA is not going to design for you, but they're also going to interact with you along the way.
So you mentioned that it's best to start early in the process. Who should be involved in the process of developing a regulatory strategy?
I pull together a team. No one can do it in a vacuum. A good regulatory strategist knows that a lot of people are involved, and that includes your toxicologists, your clinical pharmacology folks, CMC, chemistry, manufacturing, and controls, your regulatory staff, your medical and clinical staff, and of course, our friends in biostats. They all come together in helping of designing even protocols and how you take this to the next step along the way. So if it's really early on in the process, we'll say, okay, let's look at what we need for today. We have to look at, do we need to go into one or more animal models and look at that initial safety? Or is it a cell culture that we need to look at? What is that initial safety? And this could be a lab batch, what we call non-GLP, for early animal testing. We get those results and then, okay, so we're now going to start developing the manufacturing process. And the client may have somebody to do that. We just console and go along. Have you looked at your analytic methods? How do we go forward? And pulling that through. And pulling it through is to the next step. How can we get you ready for that first interaction with the agency, which could be an interact meeting where it's that almost pre-IND where you get that initial consult and back and forth and prepare that pre-IND meeting and meeting package where the company puts forth their question. This is what we'd like to do, FDA. This is what we've done to get us to this point, and this is how we'd like to proceed in humans. FDA will come back during that either on a TCON, not so much face-to-face at the moment due to the lasting from the pandemic, or written responses, and really give that initial guidance before we even start writing the IND and pulling us to the next stage, pulling together that IND with all these different team members involved with the client of what It's the next step. Then what does it take you to get this approval to go into clinical trial? And a lot of us work in parallel.
Let me ask you this, MerriBeth. How do you chart a roadmap to success when you're traveling in uncharted territory? When you are on the edge of science and perhaps you're doing something where there's not a clearly trodden path?
That's one of the areas that most people are in today. As we look at the new biologics coming down, that personalized medicine, med tech, how it's, drugs that are derived from a patient for a patient. How's that? And so we talk to the KOLs, the company. We go back and look at regulatory experience in parallel paths or disease indication. And are we on that right path? So getting together, trying to do that initial work. And that's where some of these early meetings with the agency, because you are in uncharted territory, where you really want to discuss with them, this is what I have, and I'm not so sure would I be required because it's so early. And they'll come back and have those initial discussions with you. And it's so important. But you're also starting from a company aspect, that rapport, that communication. You're probably going to spend the next number of years working back and forth at different stages with different folks within the regulatory agency, as well as your consultants and staff as you're bringing the product through development. But in that beginning, we have to show them what we have. We do our homework. We do regulatory intelligence. We look at the product. We look at the potential indications. So it may not be the cure for AIDS, but does it have other application? And then what is the commercial viability of doing that?
Getting input early on in the process, then, you're saying is extremely valuable. It's better to get that input early on, both from a gathering information perspective, discovering what may be required of you, what you still need, and from a developing rapport process, because when there's not a clear path, there's going to be really work to build a path together.
Exactly. And there's one more piece, Jennifer, that goes into this. Many of our small and emerging biotechs are looking for funding at the same time. So the same roadmap and strategy that we're giving to them to help them in development also helps them present a clear and concise picture to the capitalists or however they're getting their funding. And it's clear that, we're going to need approximately X amount of dollars for this stage. And it helps set benchmarks and points where the funders looking say, okay, here's your benchmark and we're coming here and we'll fund you to the X date. And so that whole strategy plays into dealing with who may ever be doing the financing as well.
So, in taking the time and gathering the expertise to develop a regulatory strategy, you have solid scientific and regulatory information. You develop a solid scientific plan, and this assists on the business side. You're really dovetailing the science and the business with the regulations, so that it's all laid out clearly together. Everybody can see where we are, where we're going, and what it will take to get there.
Exactly. And it's not saying that there aren't bumps in the road. Part of research and development is exactly that you may have turns in the road, but you've learned what these risks are, you identify them, and then you can mitigate them without them sending you back to the drawing board in most cases.
So that's super important, what you just said, because I can plan any journey and there will almost certainly be something that goes not according to plan. And what you just said, I think, is because you've done this many times, you can kind of anticipate some of those issues and know what to do rather than just freaking out when a rock appears in the middle of the path.
Yeah. Do we go around the rock? Do we have to blast through the rock? And how do we best do that while trying to keep in mind the end goal and what it takes to make whatever change or mitigation is needed?
What is a good regulatory strategy? What is a good plan? How do I know that the plan that somebody has developed for me or that I think I can develop by myself is a good plan versus here's some characteristics that show maybe you need to work on this a little bit more?
You pressure test the plan, just like you do your roadmap. when you're driving somewhere that you've never been before. Have outside folks look at it, have colleagues look at it that weren't part of developing that plan. And as I say, we kind of shoot at it, but trying to pull out, have we thought of everything that was possible? Have we looked at it in a holistic approach? And then where can we help? Where can I help as your consultant, either with all or just a piece of it? Because many companies have, their own staff as well, and they're quite knowledgeable. No one goes into this, totally naive, but everyone brings a piece to the party. And that party, the goal of the celebration then is the release of that drug product.
The release of a product, getting a product to the patients who need it. And as you said, it may not be who you thought when you started, but it's still getting something to people that will make their lives better.
That's the ultimate goal. We do always, even from my early days in the laboratory and in nuclear medicine, look at the syringe and say, we do no harm, and make that plan so that that person who needs it on the other side is getting something that we know is safe, that it's efficacious, and can really help them in their journey of treatment and hopefully recovery.
Thank you so much, MerriBeth. This has been informative for me, and I'm sure it has been for our listeners as well. In this episode, we talked about how developing a regulatory strategy can save you time and money and set you up for success. In our next episode, we will discuss the challenges and opportunities of multinational clinical trials. Thanks again for your time today, MerriBeth, and thanks to all of you who joined us. I encourage you to join us again for our next episode of Thinking Big for Small and Mid-Sized Biotechs. For more information, you can go to allucent.com. Until then, goodbye.